8th day of the Iran-Israel-US war, and Lebanon is increasingly being drawn into the heart of the conflict. Today, the Israeli military has announced it's begun what it's calling limited ground operations against Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. Now, hundreds of thousands of Lebanese living in the south have already fled their homes under mandatory evacuation orders from Israel. France 24's Delano de Souza tells us more.
An Israeli army handout shows its forces in southern Lebanon. According to Israel, troops from the 91st Division began what they're calling a limited targeted ground operation in recent days. This after evacuation orders were issued for southern Lebanon and suburbs around Beirut. The country was dragged into the US and Israel's war with Iran after Tehran's proxy Hezbollah began firing rockets into Israel on the 2nd of March.
Hezbollah is working accordingly to instructions from Tehran, not from Beirut. They are acting against the will of Lebanon and its citizens. Since the ceasefire, November 2024, Lebanon hadn't really done what it should done in order to dismantle Hezbollah, and we see now the results.
Israel's ground operation in Lebanon comes following a relentless air campaign targeting what they claim is infrastructure linked to Hezbollah. But it's an assessment Lebanese authorities dispute.
The Israeli occupation had unfortunately been claiming that ambulances were being used for non-health and non-medical purposes. We deny this. It's unjustified. These vehicles are transporting the wounded and the sick, and these nurses, doctors, and paramedics are going in those vehicles with their own lives at risk. All international laws and the Geneva Conventions protect these vehicles, yet they're being targeted.
Since Lebanon was catapulted into the ongoing war with Iran, over 830,000 people have been displaced, and calls from Paris for Hezbollah to lay down its weapons and for Israel to refrain from a ground offensive have so far gone unanswered.
Well, I'm pleased to welcome to the programme now Raz ZIMMT. He's the director of the Iran and Shiite Axis research programme at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies. Hello to you, and thanks for speaking to us today live from Tel Aviv.
Hello, good afternoon.
Look, let's start with Lebanon, if we can, given what we just saw in that report that ground operations have begun now in the south of the country. Help us understand what the goal is here. Are we talking about a limited campaign against Hezbollah, or is this really about trying to destroy a group that's already been significantly weakened by Israel?
Well, I don't think that anyone in Israel really believes that it is possible to destroy, to eliminate Hezbollah, but to move forward towards trying and disarm Hezbollah. We have to understand that we are more than a year after the ceasefire signed between Hezbollah and Israel in November 2024. And despite all the efforts made by the Lebanese army and the Lebanese government to move forward towards disarm Hezbollah, Hezbollah is still there. And so the combination between Israeli airstrikes and ground offensive, as limited as it might be, are aimed to achieve this goal.
Israel has had, though, a rather checkered operation in South Lebanon over the course of several decades. It occupied a part of South Lebanon for a good while. There was the war in 2006, where some analysts say that despite Israel's clear sort of superior military power, it was Hezbollah who was pretty successful in that war. So in a practical sense, do you think we're looking at an occupation, again, of South Lebanon, as happened during the civil war?
Well, I certainly hope that won't happen. The Israeli objective is to have some limited ground offensive to degrade as much as possible Hezbollah infrastructures and posts which were reconstituted by the organization after the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, and then to return at least to the posts where Israel occupied after the ceasefire. We all hope that a more stable and sustainable status quo will be achievable, but it mostly depends on the ability and willingness by the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah.
You know, you talk about a limited campaign in the south of Lebanon. What about Beirut, the Lebanese capital, under now parts of it, an unprecedented evacuation order by the Israeli army. What's Israel's strategy there?
Well, here again, the problem is that since the fire, Hezbollah has not agreed to disarm itself, despite, again, all the efforts made by both Israel in the south and the Lebanese government in Beirut and sometimes in the Bekaa Valley. And so there are still very considerable and significant infrastructures by Hezbollah to manufacture rockets, drones, and missiles. And one of the main purposes of this campaign is, again, to degrade as much as possible Hezbollah's capabilities.
Okay, let's look at Iran then. The Israeli military saying just today that they still have thousands of targets to hit in Iran. What's your sense as to what these targets are? Is Israel looking now at Iran's nuclear program?
So I would say that there are three main families, if you like, of targets. So one is targets which are affiliated with the regime itself. For example, Revolutionary Guard, Basij, law enforcement forces, bases, and headquarters, and targeting those assets aimed to not to topple the Iranian regime, because again, I don't think that anyone really believes that it's possible to topple the Iranian regime through aerial strikes, but to undermine and weaken the Iranian regime and perhaps to pave the way. So after the war, if the protests erupts again in Iran, it might be more easy for the protesters in Iran to deal with the Iranian regime. So that's one issue. The second issue would be to deal with the remains of Iran's nuclear facilities, mainly with the facilities which the Iranians were trying to reconstitute after the 12-day war in June. And the last families of targets would be those concerning the missile capabilities. And here we have to remember that back in June, what Israel mostly did was either to destroy the launchers or to block the entrances and the exits of the underground compound of the missile. This time, the aim of both the U.S. and Israel is to try and degrade not just the launchers themselves, but Iran's ability to reconstitute its ballistic missiles program by eliminating as much as possible its production line as well.
And look, you mentioned earlier on in your answer there about the Iranian people possibly now having a bit of space to rise up against the Iranian regime. But, we know this is an existential fight for the leaders in Iran. And for the moment, we've seen none of that. Look, no defections, no protesters out in the streets. So did Israel, do you think, miscalculate what would happen after its bombing campaign began?
No, I think it was very obvious that as long as the bombing continues, as long as the planes and the missiles are in the air, nobody should expect the Iranian people to go back to the streets. I mean, we all remember that during the 12-day war, during the campaign itself, the protests which were happening in Iran before the war actually ceased. And it took about 6 months until the protest movement in Iran resumed. So I would say that the best expectation in Israel and probably also in the U.S. is that when the war is over or almost over, and the Iranians are no longer concerned with the possibility of being hit by the missiles and planes, then perhaps they would reconsider going back to the streets, assuming that this time the Iranian regime will be weakened enough, and that could perhaps create a different balance of power between the regime, its supporters on the one hand, and the protesters on the other hand.
And look, the Israeli army saying that it anticipates about another 3 weeks at the moment of conflict in Iran. Donald Trump, though, last week sort of saying, look, we've done really well. We kind of want to wrap things up quite soon. Is there a real difference now between the American and the Israeli endpoint and when they want this to stop?
I'm not sure. At the end of the day, it's going to be a decision to be made by President Trump. I mean, I don't think that it's very likely that if President Trump decides at some point to stop this war, Israel will continue to do that. But I think that the U.S. and Israel are very much coordinated in trying to achieve the military objectives, meaning degrading Iran's capabilities as much as possible. And I think that they both understand that it might take several weeks to achieve that.
Look, I did want to ask you about how this is all playing out on the home front in Israel. But before I do, let's watch this report that looks at that very question.
The US-Israeli campaign in Iran is mainly being fought in the air. But just how long can Israel go on? With the support of the United States, the Israeli military claims it is in it for the long haul.
Starts with weeks of planning, months of planning, that's sitting on a level of coordination that's been worked on for years.
But a lengthy conflict could be more costly, with its ammunition stocks in limited supply, a source of concern for its military leaders. The Jewish state has also endured repeated missile and drone strikes which must be intercepted and destroyed by the famous Iron Dome for short-range rockets and artillery. David Sling to counter medium-range rockets and cruise missiles, and Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 designed to intercept ballistic missiles. Each interceptor costs €3 million. And as the conflict with Iran rages on, Israel informed the US this week that it is running critically low on ballistic missile interceptors, according to US website Semaphore.
If there were to be a problem with interceptors, we would indeed have to end the war and reach an agreement. But if our enemies think they will win this war because we are running out of interceptors, then they are mistaken.
Israel is fighting a second front in the war in the Middle East in southern Lebanon with its forces targeting the pro-Iranian Hezbollah group. 150,000 reservists have been called up and Israeli tanks are at the border. Leaders in Israel and the United States have indicated that the conflict against Iran could last for weeks.
And Raz ZIMMT still with me from Tel Aviv. Look, we got a sense there in that report of the literal cost of this war. It's expensive. Each incoming missile costing about €3 million to intercept, we heard there. And Israelis, we imagine, are rather fatigued. I mean, there's been wars going on multiple fronts now for years. Are people worn out? How long do you think this really can go on for?
Well, actually, according to the polls carried out by several Israeli institutions, including by the way the INSS, it shows that a remarkable, significant majority of the Israelis support this war, despite the economic and psychological impact of the war. And of course, it's very uncomfortable, despite the fact that the number of missiles from Iran has reduced very significantly. But still, it certainly creates a lot of tension in Israel. But I think that the expectation in Israel is that as long as it takes to undermine and to degrade as much as possible Iran's capabilities, we should endure that, because there is only one thing which is worse or considered as worse by most Israelis, is that at the end of the day, it will take only a few months until we are forced into another round of war with Iran. So if the Israelis were told, okay, let's endure for several more weeks, but at the end of the day, it will be much more difficult for Iran to recover, then I would say that the majority of the Israelis are ready to accept that.
Last question for you, given your work on the so-called Shia axis. We've seen Hezbollah get involved in this war. Obviously, Iran is at the very center of all of this. One group, though, that we haven't heard very much from is the Houthis in Yemen. What's your sense as to why they're not getting involved?
Yeah, that's one of the questions we're trying to give an answer. We don't really have a good answer. The one possibility is that they want to maintain or to leave their capabilities to the next stage of possible escalation in the region. Other one is that they are very much concerned with the possibility that if they engage themselves in a confrontation with Israel and the United States, they will have to pay a price, and there is no guarantee that if there is a ceasefire between Israel and the United States and Iran, this will also include the Houthis. So they might be also under some kind of constraint following more than 2 years of being engaged in this regional war in the Middle East.
All right, Raz ZIMMT talking to us there from Israel's Institute for National Security Studies. Thank you very much.